I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Ellen Maria Gorison Lecture, which is entitled Historical Fiction in an Age of Misinformation. The Ellen Maria Gorison Fellowship was established in 2001, shortly after the Academy opened its doors, and over the past 20 years, it has made it possible for some 40 outstanding individuals to come to the Academy, individuals in a wide range of disciplines, and among them are the historian Carolyn Bynum, journalist Jane Kramer, intellectual historian Martin Jay, and the legal scholar Joy Milligan. Ellen Maria Gorison was the daughter of Hans Arnold, after whom these premises are named. Born in 1916, she and her family emigrated to the United States after the Nazis took power. She worked as a journalist after the war, and she was an outspoken advocate of a new idea circulating at the time that was called the United Nations. The villa we find ourselves in tonight was her family home. Ellen Maria Gorison passed away in 1996, shortly before the Academy was founded, but her daughter Nina von Maltzahn, who unfortunately we also lost just last year, and the entire Arnold family remains the Academy's most prolific benefactors to this day, and for that we're deeply grateful. The Academy is really fortunate to have three extraordinary fiction writers here this semester: Lauren Groff, Lori Moore, and Cristina Rivera Garza. And I don't think that we have ever had such a wealth of literary talent and achievement in one term. And tonight I have the pleasure to introduce to you the first of these, the Ellen Maria Gorison Fellow for this spring semester. Lauren Groff has published 4 novels and 2 short story collections since 2008 and has become one of the most celebrated writers working in America today. Her first book, The Monsters of Templeton, debuted on the New York Times bestseller list. How can that be? How does that happen, Lauren? It was a first... It was a first novel rich in world and history, was the verdict of the Frankfurter Allgemeine. Her second novel, Arcadia, was named by the Times one of the best books of the year. Her third novel, Fates and Furies, was another New York Times bestseller, and the Süddeutsche Zeitung called it, quote, a subtly subversive book that tells of deep loneliness and of the unknown sides of the person we think we know best. Matrix, her fourth and truly unputdownable most recent novel, and that is an English word that has many words pushed together, as almost as in German, is according to Amazon in very bold letters an instant New York Times bestseller. And for those of you who haven't read it, Matrix is a truly fabulous work of historical fiction that imagines the life of Marie de France, the first recorded woman poet in the French language, an extraordinarily spirited individual who Eleanor of Aquitaine exiled from court at the age of 17 and who comes to England and turns an impoverished abbey into a miraculous safe haven for her nuns. The Guardian, writing of Matrix, said, Groff has written a beautiful, unclassifiable book, a queer story that reclaims a great poet from the past and fills her with glorious, incarnate life. Now, it is also worth mentioning that Lauren has fans in high places. None other than former U.S. President Barack Obama said that Fates and Furies was his favorite book of 2015. Our novelist, learning of his choice, tweeted, and I quote, I just died, came back to life, read again, died again. That's it, I retire. Evidently not. In 2021, Matrix was also the first book on Barack Obama's favorite books of the year list. Now, and this is really and truly just a footnote, as it happens, I worked for 4 years for Barack Obama. And I actually worked quite hard for Barack Obama, and he never once said that anything I wrote for him or did for him or briefed him on was better than okay. I might have gotten a good. So it's taken me some time to come to grips with Lauren's well-earned success. Lauren's writings have won innumerable awards, including the Story Prize, the American Bookseller Association's Indie Choice Award, France's Grand Prix de la Héroïne. Okay. And last year she won the Joyce Carol Oates Prize. Now, if Lauren's work comes up short in any category, it is that she has been 3 times a finalist for the National Book Award for fiction, which seems pretty inexcusable to me. And if you can explain that in your talk, Lauren, we'd be very, very grateful. Her work has appeared in many different magazines, including The New Yorker, Harper's, and The Atlantic, and it has been anthologized repeatedly in the Best American Short Stories. She has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and she was named one of Granta's Best Young American Novelists. Her next book is The Vaster Wilds, set in the 17th century, so historical fiction. And it is, in her own words, a sort of female Robinson Crusoe, and it will be released in September. And there might be some expectations that she'll at long last win the National Book Award. As I said at the outset, Lauren is going to speak to us about historical fiction in an age of misinformation, and I will now get out of the way and let her do exactly that. They hired me for my technical skill. Lauren, the podium is all yours.
Wow. All my surprises are spoiled now. No. I'm so grateful that you all came out. Thank you for being here. And thank you, American Academy. I love everyone here. From, the incredible people who make the food, to Johanna, to Anna, to everyone. I just love you all. And my fellow fellows, you're brilliant. I can't wait to be there cheering for you. I had a little hype squad in the WhatsApp today. It was really lovely. Okay, so this is not meant to be the definitive talk on historical fiction in the age of misinformation. I really just kind of panicked, and I was like, I'll talk about that. So here we go. And there will be times when some of my slides are blank. That's not an accident. It was meant to be. Okay. Historical fiction. I, too, dislike it. There are things that are more important beyond all this fiddle. I'm cribbing from Marianne Moore here, who said this about poetry. The point still stands. I've long been a skeptic about historical fiction, which is odd, as these days I often find myself writing it. Some of my resistance has come from a feeling that there are so many problems bearing down on us right now, so many catastrophes that will be exponentially worse in the future if we don't deal with them immediately, that looking to the past can feel like a reactionary or conservative impulse. Some of my skepticism is due to snobbery. For a long time, historical fiction was cardboard characters animated only by lust, maids in waiting bursting out of their bodices, Highlanders wearing nothing under their kilts. And I also read Gone with the Wind when I was 9, and so that really sunk in deep. I went to school to write literary fiction, which, at least according to people who write literary fiction, is the genre where art is made. This particular snobbery is a bit of a hand-me-down from the artists of the past. Henry James, for instance, this dour, beautiful fellow, once wrote in a letter to Sarah Orne Jewett about the historical work in progress that she sent him, saying that the historic novel is, for me, condemned, even in cases of labor as delicate as yours, to a fatal cheapness. You may multiply the little facts that can be got from pictures and documents, relics and prints as much as you like. The real thing is almost impossible to do, and in its absence, the whole effect is as naught. I mean the invention, the representation of the old consciousness, the soul, the sense, the horizon, the vision of individuals in whose minds half the things that make ours, that make the modern world, were non-existent. Go back to the country of the pointed firs. Come back to the present, palpable, intimate that throbs, responsive, and that once misses, needs you. And God knows, and that suffers woefully in your absence. Now, if I were to receive such a letter from Henry James, in which my historical work was described as having a fatal cheapness, the project at hand would be slain dead. Either I would be too, or I would quit writing and go back to school and become a landscape architect. Plants don't tell you that your work has a fatal cheapness, they just wilt and die. I agree with some of the things James says here, that it's the artist's job to hold up a mirror to the present, to clarify the present's hypocrisies in the crucible of art, and perhaps even to show the reader their own complicity in corrupt systems. I'd go a little farther to say that I believe that real, good, true art is not only celebratory, that real, good, true art is inherently and lovingly oppositional. I think frequently about this quote by James Baldwin that says, "The role of the artist is exactly the same as the role of the lover. If I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see." Often, intentional blank slide, if we're talking about structural issues that we don't see them because we benefit from them. It doesn't behoove us to swim against the current because it's exhausting to swim against the current. It takes a huge amount of willpower. If you're born to the current, it's just easier to be carried along. At least until we pick up a piece of art that lifts us out of the water for a spell so that we can clearly see what has been invisible to us. Not only the water we were in, but the waves, the wind on the surface, the creatures swimming beneath. But I also have to say, I think James's idea of historical fiction is pretty shallow. I love Henry James. I'm sorry. Ghost of Henry James. What we are going for when we are writing historical fiction is not the replication of an anti-consciousness, a sort of mimicking of the past into verisimilitude, but rather an interpretation of it from the standpoint of the present. After all, because art comes from an individual sensibility with all the baked-in biases and myopia that make for a subjective understanding of the world, all fiction is, in the end, interpretation only. The reader knows this inherently. Also, I remembered, embarrassingly, belatedly, that there's no such thing as ahistorical fiction. As my good friend Hernan Diaz once said to me with exasperation, all novels are historical. All novels are a sculpture of character and time through the medium of words. All books are infused with the era in which they are written, whether they are set in the past or in an imagined future. And all books are meant to be time travelers, written in the ever-changing present with understandings gleaned from the past, projected into the future when the reader will meet the book from within their own unimaginable present, and through reading, make all the time periods come alive together. I would argue that far from being a conservative form of fiction writing, by this I mean backwards looking to the exclusion of the contemporary, historical fiction in the best of hands can be a way to make more vivid our understanding of the present and even the future. Here's a little aside. Know that I'm talking about not historical fiction as pretty lies that lead to escapism, which I know does exist, and which I think Henry James was perhaps reacting to in his letter to Jewett. It may be a bit of a radical statement, but here's another belief I hold about art. I believe that if art is made to conform to prevalent standards or to uphold current systems, it's not art at all, but a particularly pernicious and seductive form of entertainment. There is a place for this kind of work. Sometimes we do just need to escape. Netflix exists for a reason. But this is not the kind of work I want to do or want to read usually, and it's not the kind of historical fiction I'm talking about today. Rather, I'm talking about historical fiction as a way of combining perception and imagination to create tools of radical truth. Now, it may be counterintuitive that I'm making the claim that historical fiction can be a way to offset the ceaseless, overpowering tsunamis of conspiracy theories, machinations, perfidy, and blatant lies that we're drowning in right now. Sorry, I had a cold early in the week, and it's gone, but my throat is not. This is only if one uses the word fiction as a synonym for the word lie, which people who do not write fiction tend to do. A lie is, in most rubrics, a moral failure. In the hands of an artist, fiction is morally rigorous. It's a work of exhaustive ethical questioning on both the macro, plot and machinery levels, and the micro, the tiny choices of word and punctuation levels. Just because imagination is in play in literary or historical fiction doesn't mean that the writer just throws lie after lie onto the page. It means the superstructure of the story needs to be rigorously invested in verifiable fact. And imagination becomes the breath that gives the story life. Literary fiction that does its job well is the very opposite of lying. I have been inspired in my thinking about how we engage with history by the extraordinary work of a professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University. She's a MacArthur genius, and her name is Dr. Saidiya Hartman. If you're not aware of her work yet, I recommend all of her books, but particularly Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, Intimate Histories of Riotous Black Girls, Troublesome Women, and Queer Radicals. Excuse me. Just so you know, you have to go to Disman's to go buy this book. It's really absolutely phenomenal. In any case, Dr. Hartman practices astonishingly rigorous primary source historical research in the archives of the past. But she also recognizes that much of the material she seeks, particularly on the Black and enslaved people that so often form the center of her work, was destroyed, or it had never existed because it was not deemed important. Or if it does still exist, it exists in a twisted way, a way designed to uphold the supremacy of those in power. How does a historian see through the silence to animate the past in a way comprehensible for a modern audience? Dr. Hartman came up with the solution to interrogate the archives themselves through a method she calls critical fabulation. In Wayward Lives, she says, and I put the quotes here so you can read along, "Notebooks, monographs, case files, and photographs created the trails I followed, but I read these documents against the grain, disturbing and breaking open the stories they told in order to narrate my own. It required me to speculate, listen intensely, read between the lines, attend to the disorder and mess of the archive, and to honor silence." Dr. Hartman also says in Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments that for decades I'd been obsessed with anonymous figures and much of my intellectual labor devoted to reconstructing the experience of the unknown and retrieving minor lives from oblivion. It was my way of redressing the violence of history, crafting a love letter to all those who had been harmed. I was struck with wonder and delight when I first read of Dr. Hartman's work, which is in fact quite radical. Paying attention to the minor characters, the elided and forgotten of history goes against the way that most of us were taught whatever history we do know, which can be characterized as a series of great man's stepping stones like self-contained, self-important islands standing firm in the flow of time. But this conception of history is itself perhaps the most anti-democratic, anti-humanist, flat-out meretricious myth that we humans have been perpetrating on ourselves for millennia. And it's a lie in multiple directions. For one, if you're led to see history as a series of progressions through time, you'll believe that humans only advance. We don't constantly regress, revert, fail spectacularly. We can have a false sense of security that the moral arc of the universe will inevitably bend toward progress, when we are actually constantly beset by vast periods when the moral arc springs parallelly backwards, harming millions of people in its wild gyrations. I fear that we're at such a point right now, and I'm not, of course, blaming any actual historians in this. This is the way that we've been taught history in schools, at least Americans. Second, though, it is insane that we are taught to see history as necessarily a series of great men, one after the other. The skull of the United States' first president, George Washington, sliding open neatly so that his successor, John Adams, can pop out. Oh, not this Lincoln. John Adams' skull sliding open neatly so that Thomas Jefferson can pop out, etc., all the way to Joe Biden popping out. History as a weird little presidential Matryoshka doll. So I was so delighted that I actually found a picture of this that I went searching for more, and here's another one that's even funnier. This is my favorite. It's so weird. It's on Etsy, and I kind of want to buy it. It's so strange. Okay. Anyway. All right. Such ingrained bias is obviously racist and misogynistic. By the way, what happened to those who are not white men, those of us who are women who make up over 51% of the population? Why have we allowed ourselves the narratives that enforce being ruled by the minority for millennia? How is this democratic or even just in even the most fundamental of ways? If we buy into this way of looking at the world, we will seek to be led by those who think of themselves as great men. This is why a 4-time bankrupt con artist reality show Orange Cloud of constant bloviating falsehood with no qualifications for the office was elected president over an immensely brilliant and capable woman who had been the Secretary of State. This line of great man thinking also ignores reality, in my opinion. History is happening in a million ways at any given moment. Billions of ways. It is happening in the warp and weft of ordinary everyday life. It's only in the way that we tell any story in retrospect that becomes what we know of as history. The word history contains its own animating spirit. History is a singular story we choose to tell of the infinitely plural past. I think I've made it clear that I stand in opposition to the great man lie of history. It feels to me like a profounder truth to insist that history is, in fact, many layered and complicated tissues of incredibly intricate elements that are happening all at once. And some are structural, and some are flukes of fate or chance or personality, and some are due to long-term collective action. I'd also argue passionately that, perhaps, the past is far better understood by trying to think through the lives of the average person than it is by thinking through the life of the exceptional person. Literary fiction is brilliant at illuminating the life of the normal human being. When one is writing about a battle, for instance, straightforward academic or popular history can give us a great list of troop movements and orders given, can bring us to an intellectual understanding of how the parties got to the point of rupture, or what led to this very moment in time, and these are very good and worthy things to know. But one can often be forgiven for feeling as if one is looking through binoculars at something barely visible in the distance. History, as it has been taught, at least to high school students for generations, stands safely on the hill with Napoleon. Even if a historical narrative includes primary first-person stories from those who have lived in those moments, these are almost always necessarily narratives that have been composed after the worst of the crisis is over. Narratives written when thoughts can be collected and clarified. Nobody is going to kneel down in the middle of a charge, bullets whizzing by, cannons roaring to scribble in a little pocket notebook one's conflicted feelings about the near prospect of death. But fiction can give us such immediacy. It is imagination that brings us down into the battle. It kindles facts into flame. Think of Prince Andrei in War and Peace, in the middle of a skirmish, watching men die all around him, looking up in wonder at the blue sky. And that is my most favorite moment in all of literature. It's so spectacular. All right. So here, not that I'm doing War and Peace, of course, but I'm going to give you now a tiny dose of my upcoming novel, The Vaster Wilds, set in the starving time of winter, 1609 to 1610 in Jamestown, Virginia. Jamestown, for those of you who don't know, is the first permanent English settlement in North America. I relied on a number of primary sources for this book, but of course, nearly all the primary sources were written by English colonizers, so they were involved in upholding European expansionism and racism in the New World. So my book is kind of subversive in some ways. It's taking a bit of a more nuanced look at what happened. And a lot of what was in my primary materials had been illustrative of the barbarism of the native peoples. It feels not right in the 21st century. Okay, so this is John Smith's, one of his books, like the frontispiece there, and that is John Smith looking so gloriously like smug that I had to put him up here. And he's like an incredible fiction writer in the lie sense of the term. He did a lot of tweaking of the truth, which is kind of fun to look at, and try to see what historians are saying about him now. It's very funny. Okay. So here's a little bit of this book, and I hope nobody from Riverhead in the U.S. is watching, because I'm about to give you just a brief glimpse of rejected covers for this book. This is not the finished cover, because we don't have one yet. There you go. All right. Okay. I don't think I was allowed to do that, but I did it anyway. All right. All right. Here's a little bit of the story based on a sort of an apocryphal story from the vaster wilds. The worst story was the one that belonged to the first wave of settlers, when the gentlemen who had come had refused to dirty their hands with the hard, necessary work, and the soldiers were lusty for treasure and did nothing but search for gold, which they did not find. In this godless time, there had been a soldier who had come across one of the Powhatan girls in the forest and, starved to madness for the company of women, had pushed the girl down and had his way with her body as she screamed and wept. And when he had used her, he left her lying there in the dirt bleeding. Some time passed, then one day, when this same man was out in the bay gathering oysters, he looked up to find that his companions were nowhere near him, that they had disappeared as if they had been told to flee, and even the birds in the trees had silenced themselves and were waiting. Then, as though magicked out of the fog that lay upon the waters, women began to take shape all around him and came close and had him surrounded in silence. Before he could cry out, they put a leather thong in his mouth so that he was muted and could not scream. Then they dragged him away with them by the hair of his head, and in that same night 4 women tied him as naked as a newborn babe to the twin trees visible from the gate of the fort, the man's arms and legs wrenched outspread and his body stretched to the near breaking of his joints. Then they built a fire in front of him so that his pale skin was glowing against the dark behind him, and they loosed the thong in his mouth so that his screams could be heard even into the heart of the fort. All at once, more women poured out of the forest with sharpened oyster shells in their hands. With these as their knives, the women really, if you're afraid of violence, definitely close your ears. The women slowly flayed the skin off the man, first his eyelids, so that he had no choice but to watch what they were doing to him. Next, the skin of his arms and legs and his belly, all of which they threw into the fire before his peeled eyes. Then they removed the tongue from his mouth so that, though he could no longer speak words and pray to his God, he could yet scream through the clotting, pouring blood. Then they removed his privy members. They took the figs first, then the manhood. At this, at last, he lost his senses entirely, and they waited for him to wake again, singing and laughing, before they made him watch as they threw his useless male parts upon the spitting, devouring fire. Only then in mercy did they slit his throat and let the hot blood pour out to steam upon the ground. All right, that's pretty violent. Sorry I did that to you. What I just read is actually based on the purported and, again, perhaps anachronistic death of John Ratcliffe, who was the second president of the colony of Jamestown. Though, of course, nobody says that the reasons for his death were because he did something to a girl. So I made the man a more anonymous colonist. One of the benefits of writing historical fiction is that one can bend the past away from the clear statements in primary sources and toward a bit of the understandings of the present. Now, don't get me wrong. I would never, ever insist on the preeminence of historical fiction over actual history. History can exist beautifully without fiction, but the kind of good historical fiction that I'm talking about could not survive without excellent, intensive historical research by specialists. I personally could not have written my last novel, Matrix, without a good deal of unbelievably brilliant work by academics like Dr. Katie Bookish and Dr. Barbara Newman. Professional historians like these are the best kinds of detectives, educating themselves with terrific depth in about a dozen different ways. Only after they've gained such insignificant understanding in so many fields do these professional historians go into the archives, rooting around in dust and parchment, where they make discoveries, synthesize their discoveries with their deep knowledge, painstakingly analyze it, and write brilliant, lucid texts that often non-academic dilettantes like me can understand. I find it truly thrilling. It's so obviously painstaking, it makes me want to take a nap. That said, there are obviously differences in terms of the audience for each discipline. Academic history and creative writing just appeal to different people. I think it's through extraordinarily varied through the extraordinarily varied non-specialism's audience, historical fiction can do things that straightforward history perhaps does not want to do. For one, books of nonfiction history are generally encountered by people who deliberately seek the subjects out. There are, of course, non-academic books, popular books, books intended for widespread appeal, but the contract that even these books proposed is a dance that almost inevitably is led by subject matter. To pick up a book of even the most popular history off the front table at their local independent bookstore, a reader has to have an idea of themselves as a person who is interested in said subject matter, be it a biography of Cleopatra or an examination of military airplanes through the ages. Literary fiction necessarily appeals to a less specialist audience because it isn't predominantly subject-based, but is rather character-based, voice-based, story-based, or language-based. I would buy any book at all by, say, Jesmyn Ward or Joy Williams or Zadie Smith, no matter what the subject matter that they are writing about or the time period their books may be set in, because I love these writers' brains. I love their voices. I love the language in which they choose to write. And because I have loved their past work, I trust them to carry me wherever they choose to go in their next books. If Anne Carson were to write a Zombies on Mars novel, I would pre-order it as soon as I woke up from my swoon. It would almost certainly be the best zombie novel, the best Mars novel, the best novel I've ever read. A short story or a novel may sneak its passions in with a few choice sideways lightning bolts. Pick up a Hilary Mantel book on Thomas Cromwell, and you may find yourself the way I found myself, deep in the middle of the night tracking down JSTOR articles about the social philosophy of Sir Thomas More, or on another night falling into a bottomless wormhole about the painter Hans Holbein the Younger, who was a court painter and famously painted Cromwell to look like a mobster. Did you know that this painter once painted, Anne of Cleves so beautifully that Henry VIII, who had never met her, was induced to take her as his fourth wife. And then, when he actually saw her in the flesh, he was so disappointed that she didn't live up to the portrait that he found her repulsive and would not consummate the marriage. That's fascinating, right? I didn't until Hilary Mantel made me read a book about him. I believe that discovering weird, delightful pockets of interest that induce us to further study and understanding can only be for our good, both our individual as well as our collective good. Why shouldn't a kindergarten teacher have an encyclopedic understanding of utopia, a word first coined by Sir Thomas More? Why shouldn't a retired physician assistant hear the resonance between the current COVID pandemic and the 1918 flu epidemic, which modern estimates say killed between 1% to 6% of the world population? The more we as individuals understand about the way the world has been, the more we start to see the patterns and cycles that history goes through. Anyone who understood the 1918 flu epidemic would have understood the absolute social necessity for both masking and vaccines, and wouldn't have swallowed the anti-science lies peddled by people trying to make a buck from a catastrophic massive death event. Our news sources and social media feeds are overbrimming with noise these days, with opinion that is pretending to be news, with people in whom we've put our trust and our political futures who do nothing but lie to us endlessly, cold-bloodedly, pathologically. In January 2020, the Washington Post reported that former President Trump, over the course of the 4 years he was in office, made 30,573 false or misleading claims while he was in the office of president. I just need to say that again. Trump made 30,573 false or misleading claims as the president of the United States. Okay. That's an average of 21 lies every single day when he was in the office. And this is being reported, by the way, by the Washington Post, which, though it is a very important media outlet, and there are really wonderful people who work there, and is often the source of great news, is hardly a progressive media organization. For one, it is owned by a billionaire whose company has avoided paying taxes or even living wages to its warehouse employees. As we all know, there's no such thing as a progressive billionaire. A progressive billionaire, someone who actually believes in democracy and justice, would no longer be a billionaire, or more likely would never have allowed themselves to become one in the first place. No, the truth is the Washington Post is a thoroughly mainstream neoliberal media outlet dedicated to inhabiting the exact middle axis of the political balance, no matter how profoundly the median lists to the right, pulled off center by the extremity of what passes for the right wing in the United States. In nearly any other country on the planet, our own left-wingers would be centrists. This off-kilter axis, the Washington Post makes carefully centrist. So it's not in the Post's interest to lie about the number of lies told by the former president. They are telling the truth. So in the light of such lies, a number of questions rise up. What happens when the people we are supposed to trust lie to us again and again and again? What happens when lies breed lies, even up to over 30,000 times over the course of 4 years? What happens when half the country, tens of millions of people, watch a cable channel that was created by yet another billionaire expressly to spout extreme opinions that it somehow dares to call news? I believe what happens is that different webs of reality begin to be woven out of the sheer quantity of lies. I'm actually going to move to this one. Seems apropos. These webs of reality collect, they begin to accumulate, they thicken, they become tissue. They end up making a full fabric. This fabric wraps around the bearers and becomes a shared worldview. The owners of this worldview are inherently at odds with the worldview of those they think are hostile to their own, which means that because this first worldview is based on lies, what is actual reality based on science and facts becomes suspect. In reaction, the group of people then begins to distrust experts. The professors, lawyers, doctors, journalists, scientists, and thinkers who have spent their lives reaching for and rigidly confining themselves to objective truth. The science and fact side, on the other hand, is appalled that people could put their belief in so many obvious lies. They begin to disdain and distrust the too credulous. The earth buckles, a crack echoes up to the heavens, the ground splits, and with a mighty roar the crevasse grows until it's hard to see the people standing on the other side. This is where we find ourselves now, at least in the United States. I think it's a deeply dangerous place to be. It may still seem counterintuitive to you that I'm insisting that historical fiction can push against an underhanded culture devoted to deception, and I know for sure that it cannot combat the lies alone. It would be like throwing a single tree to try to stop a tsunami. But historical fiction can do these things. It can work against the great man lie of history by illustrating and breathing life into lives lost to the archives by time and bigotry. Attention is power in this brave new world of ours. And paying attention to those who have been ignored can reset our understanding of who should and must be put into positions of responsibility over the vulnerable. It can also call other unexamined and corrosive ideas about the world into question. Fallacies about, for instance, how unchecked human-made climate change is a problem dating back only a few decades, when in fact catastrophic climate change has been in the works since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Or even perhaps fallacies about women's historical rights to control their own reproductive health, as legal and moral restrictions of abortion are an actually recent phenomenon, most only arising within the last century. Historical fiction also has the benefit of being labeled fiction. The reader knows to come to it with some skepticism, to understand from the moment they pick it up that it is only based on what happened. It doesn't claim to be fact, like the opinions that form Fox News. The contract between writer and reader is a contract for verisimilitude. It's very different, not verity. Historical fiction makes the reader take their education into their own hands, hopefully sending them to the work of real historians. But mostly what I see historical fiction doing is taking our society's flattening of the past and giving it air, expanding it so that the larger collective narrative of what the world has been gains complexity as a part of the social fabric. Every time a novel takes our understanding of the past that is flat and lifeless, say a pervasive Monty Python idea of the Middle Ages, for instance, and animates it, makes it complex, populates it teemingly with humans that have urgent needs and ideas and strangenesses and contradictions, we enrich our understanding not only of the past but of the present. When we have a better grasp on the patterns and repetitions of the past, when we understand in 3 dimensions what we're only taught in 2 dimensions, when we take the past into ourselves as a living, breathing thing, rather than an intellectual or an abstract thing, then we can begin to understand the threats that lie hidden in the present. I believe, and I look forward to hearing from you, if you think I'm wrong, which is totally fine, I write fiction, that Understanding a great swath of time, past and present, makes us far better able to handle the needs, to prepare for, to work toward, and to mitigate the harm of, in advance, of whatever the future may hold for us. All right, that's it. That's
What's the best piece of writing advice you've ever received?
Ooh. Okay. I don't know if I've ever received it. I'm trying to think of what Lori told me. I can meditate. Lori was my master's guru. Okay, so I don't know if it's advice. I'm not even sure if I believe in writing advice because individual art practices are so particular to the person, right? And they have to be tailored to the person at hand. But I think when one is actually all the time, the whole way through, you have to be kind to yourself, right? To be gentle enough to let yourself fail as much as you need to, right? And not to get upset when the failure happens because it's part of the process, which also means I don't necessarily believe in writer's block. Not that I don't believe people aren't paralyzed by, their expectations and their hopes, but because I think we can all write like the F word 100 times and call it writing, right? Like that is also writing too, right? As long as you sit down and you do it and you think. So I think letting ourselves fail as much as actually embracing failure. I tell my children this, you can embrace failure in all parts of your life except for school. And they're like, all right, that's what they want to fail. Yeah, okay, yes, right there. Hi.
Hi, thank you. You seem to have a really, really honest kind of perception about certain figures from history. Mm-hmm. The way you talked about John Smith and his smug smile and George Washington, just how ridiculous it all kind of seems that they're venerated. Have you ever researched a historical figure that you were completely surprised by or whose, like your preconceptions of them were totally and completely challenged and reversed when you delved deeper into who they were?
Such a great question. So I've had this experience before. I actually wrote a novel on, this is not a historical figure, it's a literary figure, but on Guy de Maupassant, because he was my first true literary love. He was the one who taught me how to read French. And then I started doing a great deal of research on him. And unfortunately, he, like all the other men in Bohemian France of his age, had syphilis. And he had syphilis that was so bad it became tertiary syphilis, which it really does a number on your brain. And so I started to see through time how Guy de Maupassant became so racist and so sexist, and he became a person I couldn't live with anymore. And so I had to throw out that book that I wrote and write a short story about how I hated Guy de Maupassant. So, yeah. And that's in Florida. But something that happened really pleasantly and kind of amazingly was I'd always loved Eleanor of Aquitaine. Always. I thought she was such an interesting woman. But of course, the way that people at the time wrote about her, because she was very powerful, and she made her children, her sons, rise up to try to dethrone their father. So like she was sort of treated as kind of a witch, kind of a terrible person. She's a genius. When you actually do research into her, she's like the most extraordinary person pulling every single lever in Europe at the time. She's amazing. So I fell deeply in love. Yeah, I'm deeply in love with Eleanor of Aquitaine. And it doesn't hurt that The Lion in Winter showed Katharine Hepburn, who's my favorite of all times, too, right? So, like, now I'm, like, thinking of her as, like, gorgeous Katharine. So, yeah, I think it happens a lot, right? You fall in love, you fall out of love with historical figures, and it can really break your heart when you think that you really love someone, and then you start to see, like, the cracks in the personality. Yeah. I actually want to ask you that question. Have you fallen out of love with anyone? Oh my God. Yeah. Actually, recently, just to keep it quite narrow, I've had a long-standing love affair with... Thank you. I've had a long... It's off.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I've had a long-standing love affair with Malcolm X for a very long time, having also grown up in Florida and having gone to schools that taught a very specific pedagogy. He was kind of my introduction into the critical race theory part of American history, and I swore up and down how he was my soulmate, even though he had died many years before I was even born. And then I read a book recently that came out 2 or 3 years ago called The Dead Are Arising by Les and Tamara Payne. It was a very extensive look into his life, because Les was a huge fan of Malcolm X as well. And they talked about, he kind of created this own mythology around how his father died, and also how Malcolm X had kind of played down his criminal past and the things that he had done, including pimp out his sister-in-law, and the fact that he may not have been so faithful to Betty X and the affairs that he had and the things that he actually thought. And it was so crushing to read. I actually had a little bit of an existential crisis.
Oh, no.
Because this was at the beginning of Black Lives Matter 2020, and I was just, that was not the right time to learn that information. But it was still important to know, because, you know, it's important to interrogate the mythologies we create about the people who we venerate. And it's not an easy thing to do, but it's necessary.
I think you should write a novel. You're complicating the figure. I think that's you should do it.
I'm waiting. So here's the next question.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, wonderful talk. I was fascinated by the way you talked about history and histories. It needs to be obviously in the plural somehow, because most of it that's written about great men is left out. But I was also wondering, like Hayden White called, like, you know, is the one who said that, you know, which is something that some historians may not agree to, but that every history is also writing. It needs forms of emplotment. It needs forms of storytelling. And so I'm wondering how you see then also maybe what you're doing. I love the little snippets you gave us of the next novel, how that or maybe not love, but I find it quite interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading it. But I'm wondering how you maybe see your storytelling in relation to historical storytelling, where you say you singled out some historians who did differently, but then, of course, John Smith would also be historical writing. So these are different layers of writing that are related. And you said that fiction lives through characters, through voice, through tone, maybe scenery. And I'm wondering, isn't history writing doing that too? And
for sure. It is. I'm not. And if I gave the impression that I didn't think it was, like, forgive me, because that's not at all the case. No, I think I have more issues with the way that history is taught, particularly in Florida. Because, like, if it doesn't make white people feel good, it's not being taught. It's really, really horrible. And I have children in the school systems there, and so, like, you have to actually actively work against what poor teachers are allowed to teach, right? And that's really, really awful. One of the reasons why we're here is to be immersed in a very dark history that they should know about. To be honest, I do think great historians can tell these stories so brilliantly, so wonderfully. I think a lot of academic history is not written for someone like me who doesn't have the tools to read it as well as someone who has been in academia for a long time. So I find that's a lot of the difficulty. So academic history sometimes is a little difficult for me, but there are great historians doing that work. Yes.
Well, I was thinking that what you did in your fiction is also giving a voice to maybe not historical figures or even people, but maybe to something like time.
Yes.
Or to something.
I love you for saying that. That's really
I love
point.
that. I love this passage in your story, The Midnight Zone, where you say that time is something that doesn't care about people, maybe, and that it's more animal than human. And I just love this. And that is where I think that your fiction and fiction maybe also more generally can do things that maybe you don't find in history writing.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's fiction, right? So it's the breath that gives it life is imagination, right? But I think I would hope that historical fiction that one loves and that one feels inspired by has been based very solidly on actual work by other people. Like, I do think Matrix is about time, very much. That is the point of that book. And in order to understand time, I had to go back to the way that time was experienced very differently through basically the body at the time too. So I actually had to find a lot of resources from the way that just people move through the day, move through the year, move through the Catholic calendar, right? So there are different wheels of time sort of within themselves. But I could only do that because of the work that historians did, right? So yes, I think that's sort of the breadth of imagination that can be sort of placed in fiction. It has a different function, right? Of course, right? It's a broader function, I think. Yeah. Yeah. Great.
Hi. I'm thinking about Arcadia, which I love, because when I first picked it up, my impression of it was also of historical fiction, and I was like, oh, that's interesting that like we're talking about historical fiction and your historical fiction now with Matrix and coming up with the vaster wilds, and I was just wondering, like, does it feel different to write Arcadia and think of it as historical fiction as opposed to like Matrix and now the vaster wilds that you're working on?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. So I think Arcadia is historical fiction because I was not alive. I was alive in the 70s, but I wasn't cogent, right? I wasn't like I didn't talk to people in the 70s. But there are people alive who were there and who were in places like one of the places that I studied in order to write this book. There were two primary places. One was the farm in Tennessee, and there are people living in Gainesville who told me incredible stories about the farm. And the other one was Oneida in upstate New York, but nobody's alive from Oneida, so it's really a lot of like archival stuff. But the thing about talking to human beings, sitting down with them over a cup of tea, sort of asking them questions, having them resist you for a long time, and then slowly gaining their trust enough so that they do tell you the stories, that changes a book, right? That changes the way that you see the people. You have maybe you start to invest your imaginary characters with qualities that these people that you've talked to have, and it's maybe in some ways, maybe a little easier to sort of blow life into the people because you have actual people that you have to love, right? You have to actually care for them in the text that you're working through and you're writing. So yeah, it was historical fiction, Arcadia. Of course, the final part took place in 2019 in this book, where there was, in my book that was released in 2011, a giant pandemic. So in some ways, like at the time, I thought I was writing futuristic fiction, but it ended up being historical fiction from now. Wild. Who knew? I did. I could have told you. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Sorry, Johanna.
I wanted to know if you could talk a little more about the process of writing historical fiction and if any and what friction comes up between what you were talking about with breathing life into characters and the role of imagination versus the rigor of research, and what that balance has looked like for you, or what that process has been.
Oh yeah, I love research. I could spend my whole life just researching and feel like I'm working really hard and like doing it. So I have to actually work against my my somewhat obsessive love and need to go down every rabbit hole that I find, right? So I give myself a certain amount of time to do the research, and if it's not completely done in that time, I write a draft anyway to find out what else I need to research and in what other directions I need to research. The other thing that I learned was from this amazing American writer named Catherine Davis. And if you haven't read her, She's phenomenal. She lives in Vermont. She's magnificent. She wrote a bunch of really good books, but one of her books was called Versailles. And it's basically an embodiment of Versailles. It is so weird. So it's such an amazing, like, Versailles is alive in this book. And the way that she did this was she did a huge amount of historical research. She even went to Versailles and counted off the steps it took to get through the Hall of Mirrors, right? But when she sat down to write it, she put every detail that she had into her folders. She knew exactly where it was, and then didn't look at it while she was writing the book. So that everything that was alive came to the forefront of her mind. Everything that she was in love with because it was interesting or cool but didn't serve the story didn't come up, right? And I think that was a really beautiful way to do it. And I stole that from her. And then you go back and you're like, oh, I got that wrong by 20 years, you know, like, and thank God for fact checkers, right? And thank God for the notes that you take, and so that you can go back when you're editing or rewriting. But I think it's, if it all depends on how good you are at self-regulating, and I'm very bad. So I have to put a time limitation on it. Yeah. Oh yeah. Hi, Tiffany.
Hi, Lauren.
We have a historian.
Oh my goodness. I'm not a historian. I'm just your fellow cohort.
Yeah, fellow cohort.
So your work really reminds me of Michel Rolf-Triol's work.
I don't know this person.
Okay, so I'm going to read a quote.
Okay.
From him. He was an Haitian anthropologist who studied at Johns Hopkins and died in 2015. But he wrote a book called Silencing the Past in 1995. And then it was republished with a new forward from like Hazel Carby, who's also like an awesome scholar. But this quote really reminds me of your work.
Okay.
And it may be just weirdness on my part, because I was like, I've got to look it up. But I feel like this is what your work does, which is also going back to how the past is never really past. The past is omnipresent. So in Silencing the Past, Triol writes, the past does not exist independently from the present. Indeed, the past is only part because there is a present. Just as I point to something over there only because I am here. But nothing is inherently over there or here. In that sense, the past has no content. The past, or more accurately, pastness, is a position.
That's amazing. That's exactly right,
Yeah.
I think.
Like,
Yeah.
I feel like this is your work.
Oh, well, that's nice.
Yeah,
Thank you.
but
No,
I feel,
you said it.
Oopsie. So I think, I guess this is more sort of a comment of question, but like, how do you go about doing this? I mean, I think historical fiction is also part of this. Like, the past is omnipresent in ways. You're showing us these new pasts, so to speak. And how do you go about doing this in a way that continues to be like not only sort of New York Times bestselling lists, but also like innovative and novel? Like,
Oh, that's nice. Oh, I love you. Okay, so
does
here's
this make
the deal.
sense?
Yes.
Okay.
But I think when one is writing a work of historical fiction that is actually talking to the present day, you have to actually do like Tuvalu throat singer, like you actually have to sing in both times with every sentence, right? Or try to with every sentence, where you're actually the current day and the past are speaking across the distance, right? They're meeting across the distance, and that's the purpose of writing a book like that, or my books at least. So understanding that means that every single phrase and paragraph have to be tested, right? For sort of both resonance now and resonance in the past, right? So it's and there's a lot of failure involved in this. Like I keep saying failure is like great, but failure is great, right? Because it shows you the limits of what you can do and what you can't do. And I think when one is trying to write a book where that's really very obviously talking about where we are right now, you always have to keep in mind sort of the way that the past has been interpreted, and the way that you can sort of pull interpretations apart by use of character, space, time, all of those other things. So it's just like hyper awareness, basically. Yeah, but that's such an interesting question. I would love for you to email me that quote, because that's yes. Okay, thank you. Can you say his name again?
Michel Wolf Trio.
Okay, Michel Wolf Trio. I wouldn't know. Okay, thank you. That's so great. Great. I obviously, there's one in the back. I have no filter, so I will answer anything.
Good evening. I mean, when you write fictional, historical fiction, I mean, you are a little bit bending the facts, actually.
Okay.
Of course. And, I mean, here they say lying, but that's, I think, maybe a word too strong, because lying means for me knowingly telling something what is not true.
Right.
Or when you write fiction, where is the limit for you? I mean, when to write something when you know it's untrue, or just in the sense of speculation, maybe. What is it?
Oh, that's so hard, right? There's no line you can draw because it's not a solid material, right? It's a shifty kind of interpretation-based material. So, for instance, with Matrix, because we knew literally nothing about Marie de France, right? We knew that she was from France and her name was Marie, maybe. And everything else is supposition. I felt very free, actually, right? And I knew basically the time when she was alive because I knew when her lay came out. And some of her other books, so I did have these very firm things that I believed I knew. And then from then on, because I'm really just animating someone who's just a cipher. She's a shadow. I could do anything I wanted to do. On the other hand, I did try very hard in this book to not put anything in that I didn't find in the historical record. That said, I put a lot in that was based on rumor, myth. They thought differently in the Middle Ages, right? There was a different cast of minds when I think what we would call magic now was just omnipresent, right? And mysteries didn't necessarily have to be explained in scientific ways, right? So there was a lot of beautiful, drifting theories about the world that could not be founded in truth. So I allowed that to exist in my book, but it had to be predicated on something that I'd found in the historical record. So in Matrix, there's a giant labyrinth. The labyrinth never actually existed. But there was an apocryphal story about how Henry II had this beautiful mistress named Rosamond. And the story was throughout the land, throughout England, was that because Eleanor of Aquitaine was a dragon, right, she was descended from dragons, Henry had to put his mistress in the center of a labyrinthine garden to keep her safe from Eleanor. And it didn't work. Eleanor got in somehow, poured poison into her ear and killed her, right? So this was a story that people believed was true. Sorry. It was not true. It's all apocryphal. But I was able to use that because it was something sort of like in the texture of the world itself. But again, there's a lot that's like, it's invention, right? What you're doing when you're writing a book is that you're inventing. So I tried very hard not to invent anything whole cloth. I had to take other things out of what I knew of the world. And my understanding of the world is the understanding of a novelist. It's not an understanding of someone who lived back then or even a historian who studies it. Yeah. There has to be some kind of leeway, right? And believe me, people write letters. I know where I got it wrong. And I'm grateful, as long as they're nice. They're not mean. They've been mean. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Do you feel that historical fiction can actually be dangerous? Perhaps not as dangerous as Fox News or Trump's 30,000 Lies, but at what point can historical imagination shade into historical relativizing or reinvention? You mentioned Gone with the Wind at the beginning of this of this talk. I'm sure you have a very different relation to that view now than you did back when you read it at the age of 9.
Oh, 100%. And I think you're right. I think it can be very dangerous as well. And you're absolutely correct. And I'm sure there are many instances of books out there that are actually morally corrupt and would actually hurt the world. I can't think of any other thing Gone with the Wind at the moment. It's because you suggested it. But that's an intense book. Yeah, I do think it can be dangerous. I think, the purpose of my talk was to do a thought experiment in some ways, to try to defend historical fiction from people who would summarily throw it in the trash. Because I do think there's very real use in it if used correctly, right? But again, any fiction has a side of danger to it, I think. I mean, like any fiction, I'm thinking even of fiction that is the most brilliant fiction on the planet. I think of Nabokov's Lolita, right? Which I find a beautiful, beautiful book. It's an incredible book. I read it as a prepubescent girl, and it got into my skin, right? And it changed my understanding of sexuality and of men in a very bad way, right? It actually changed my my feeling of men. So I do think fiction, even if it is beautiful, right? Even if it is seductive, the way that Lolita is. I mean, I would say that book for me, for the reader I was when I was a prepubescent reading it, that was a dangerous book for me. That was a destructive book for me. That doesn't mean that at 44 I don't read it and admire the heck out of it. I do. It's incredible. But there is a time and a place, right, for all fiction. Yeah. Oh, yay. From a historian.
Well, it's just actually a very brief point. I mean, I think a number of the questions that were asked earlier were the ones that I would ask about the role of imagination and so forth, and you've addressed that. I would just point out that there is a type of professional historian who does actually write historical fiction too. There are people who do that. What's interesting is they seem often to write their historical fiction under pseudonyms. Not sure why that is. But in any event, you might look out for that, or maybe you know about other cases that you would want to comment on here. But there are people basically who are working in both genres at once. I'm not one of them, just so you know.
No. I would love to read one of your historical
Although maybe
fictions.
I should become one.
You should, please. I think there is stigma, right? There's stigma attached to this idea that historical fiction is not a worthy aim. And I do know some, but I'm not going to out them here. They can come out themselves if they want to. Yes, I'm aware. I would love for everyone to claim their arts, right? If they truly believe in it and they think it should be in the world, then they really need to step up and say, this is good stuff. You all should read it, right? Under my name.
So historian number 2.
Yeah, I love it. Actually, a part of this talk actually came from you, because the first time I met you, you said, I'm not convinced by historical fiction.
Well, yeah, so I'll follow up on that.
I love it.
Well, a moment ago when you were talking about the difficulty of recreating the Middle Ages and figuring out how people thought, the mindset, the mentality of the Middle Ages, incredibly difficult to do, worth doing. But why not just write about the present? I mean, you know the mentality of the present, right? So why not just stage your fiction in a reality that you know intimately, rather than go back 8 centuries to a reality that you admit is very difficult, maybe impossible to know. I know that you actually do both. I know that. I mean, I know that I've read some of your short fiction that is set in the present, and I love it. But partly I love it because I have a sense that you really know it, right? Whereas when people write historical fiction, I wonder, how do they really get to... I'm reading a book about World War II right now by a German author. And I suspect that something's not quite right. Because this person didn't live through it. It's not personal experience, do you see? Anyway, so that's just kind of a question of curiosity.
I hear you. I do want to say that you did think Harry Krunzu's The Red Pill was an incredible representation of Berlin at a time that he could not possibly have actually experienced himself, right?
Maybe
Yeah.
It was more the problem than the reality.
Okay. The reason why I don't is because I think that I can do it. And I do it really well. And if you don't think so, that's fine. I love you anyway. That's fine. It's also really fun and cool, right? I mean, I think if we're made miserable by the work that we're doing at right now, then maybe we should do something else. And at the time that I wanted to write this book, it was deep in the Trump presidency. I was so unhappy. Every day, it was like a tsunami of dread was crashing on my head because we were being steered by a nincompoop. And I was in a house with two boys and a man, and I wanted to get away from men, right? And part of it too is I wanted to write about the contemporary. I really did. But I didn't want to write about cell phones, which I find stupid. I didn't want to write about Donald Trump, which I find even dumber. I didn't want to write about, the annoying problems of today that would have had to show up in my book at the time. I wanted to write about very specific things about being a woman in a position of power, being a woman among only other women. In Matrix, there are only women in this book. Even the animals are women. Very deliberately. And how else could I have done that if I hadn't gone back into time or forward into space, into like a utopia of astronaut women, which was not interesting to me. So yeah. I did it because I could. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Hi.
So I have a question. I recently read a book in German about the American West, a historical fiction, and I'm from the American West. Oh. And they picked up on things that I would have absolutely never thought about, that were seemingly meaningless to me, but that was fascinating to the mind of maybe the author, but maybe it represents something broader that I'm unaware of. Have you ever read something in a contemporary or a present-day text about a historical time from a culture or a background that's maybe not your own, maybe a French contemporary source, that's changed the way you've written, or that's changed the way you thought about how you should bring that history to the present?
Oh my God, I'm sure, right? I'm sure. I have no idea. I have no ability to go back and understand what it was that I did. But yes, I mean, that's the whole contract with the work that you do, is that you're going to be your mind is just going to be blown by the research that you've done, and it'll change the course of the book that at hand. Yes, absolutely. It happens all the time. I think that's what we seek when forget the collective. I don't know what other people do. But when I try to do research, I try to find that thing that's thrilling and weird and novel and strange and makes me see the world slightly differently, right? That's the thing that's alive, that's going to make it into the book. So it's a series of very small explosions like that all the way through. Yeah. Johanna, sorry. Okay, last question. Okay, thank you.
Have you ever considered writing about famous scientists whose discoveries have perhaps put them in a very difficult position? I'm thinking, obviously of Galileo, or perhaps Newton, who we all know about, but maybe many people don't know he also believed, apart from celestial physics, also believed in alchemy, but also women scientists like Madame Curie. Is that an avenue you have ever contemplated exploring?
I will not shut the door. Okay. It's possible, yeah. No, at the moment I'm just deeply, in terms of science, like really into black holes right now. And I'm trying to figure out a way that you can write black holes into books. But I have no idea about the scientists themselves.
Well, there are many books about famous scientists, but I've never ever come across the type of book that you write about, historical fiction, about scientists such as
Alice Munro wrote this amazing short story that Lori is going to remember the title of, about an incredible Russian scientist. Do you remember what it's called? It was one of her later stories. It was a really long one. It was a 20,000-worder. And it was in the New Yorker. And if I remember by the end of the night, I will let you know about it. It's
Mendeleev?
Incredible. What's that?
Mendeleev?
No, she was a woman, a female Russian mathematician, not scientist. It's all science to me.
Mathematicians are okay too.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Lauren. That was fabulous. I had a million questions, but I've restrained myself, and I'm going to pepper you with them tomorrow at lunch, I think. And I'm just so grateful that we've had that up there all this time. Yeah, more memento moris for at the American Academy, I say. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed that as much as I did. I just want to let you know that our next event will be on the 22nd of this month at 7:30. We'll be joined by Jeff Feltman, Ambassador Jeff Feltman, former Undersecretary for Political Affairs at the UN, former Assistant Secretary of State at the in the U.S. for Near East, and he will give a talk on the very small issue of war, peace, and the international system after Ukraine, which somehow dovetails with today's talk, and as we talk about the joys of contemporary history. On the 28th, another fellow anthropologist, Simone Howe, will talk about the connections between the melting Arctic and the plight of coastal cities facing sea level rise, a very Floridian problem. And the lecture is entitled The Future of Water. It will also start at 7:30 p.m. If you're looking for any more information about our events, please do have a look at our website, americanacademy.de, and you can also find the entire program for the spring semester. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a great evening.